9 wars started for stupid causes. There have been dozens of distinct reasons for wars to start across the long and wretched history of armed conflict. Independence, territorial disputes, cultural differences, religious beliefs, philosophical beliefs, or simply living next to each other for an extended period have all caused otherwise normal and sane people to reach for the nearest knife and try to dismember as many of their fellows as they can. Humans live in groups that call themselves nations, and it appears hard for them to coexist without wanting to start shoving people. There have been historical instances where two hostile groups of people were simply too inconsiderate to give it much thought. No matter how flimsy or strange the justification, they jumped at the first chance to start rucking because they truly, really wanted to go to war. Perhaps they were so fired up and eager to kill that any harmless trigger event would have set the tanks in motion across the border. These conflicts would all be comical if so many people hadn't died. But they existed at least in part because of some idiotic reasons. 1. The Pig War. A quarrel over a slain pig almost resulted in a full-scale conflict between the United States and Great Britain during the appropriately titled Pig War. San Juan Island, a piece of territory sandwiched between the U.S. mainland and Vancouver Island, is where the issue started in 1859. Both American settlers and British Hudson's Bay Company personnel claimed the island at the time, and both were partial to its rich soil. On June 15, 1859, an American farmer named Lyman Cutler shot a black boar owned by the British after he saw the animal snooping around his potato patch. This was the first and only shot fired in the Pig War. Tensions between the two groups of settlers escalated after the confrontation over the dead hog, and Cutler was eventually threatened with arrest. Following the Americans' military report of the incident, Captain George Pickett, who would go on to become a Confederate general in the Civil War, was sent by the U.S. Army to San Juan, along with a small contingent of soldiers. The British retaliated by dispatching a fleet of heavily armed naval warships to the coast, after Pickett escalated the situation by declaring the entire island to be American territory. There was a ridiculous stalemate that lasted for several excruciating weeks, during which the situation was precarious. In October 1859, after much negotiation, the two countries agreed to a joint military takeover of San Juan Island, bringing an end to the Pig War and leaving no casualties except one unhappy hog. 2. The Nika riot. Huge crowds flooded Constantinople's streets in 532 AD, setting fire to a significant portion of the city and almost toppling Emperor Justinian's administration, all in the name of chariot racing. The Hippodrome in Constantinople had seen a surge in popularity throughout the 6th century, and spectators had divided into rigid groups. The most influential organizations, referred to as the Blues and the Greens, gained notoriety for their brutality. These archaic hooligans behaved more like street gangs than sports supporters. When Emperor Justinian refused to free two Blues and Greens members who had been given death sentences, conflict broke out in January 532. The two factions united in an uncommon show of solidarity and started a riot. Within a few days, they had engaged in combat with imperial guards, set fire to the city prefect's headquarters, and even made an effort to usurp the throne. In the face of a full-scale revolt, Justinian ultimately decided to use force to put an end to the uprising. The emperor unleashed a deadly attack on the hooligans who were still standing after he bought off the Blues to win their loyalty. Approximately 30,000 members of the crowd lay dead on the Hippodrome grounds by the time the attack ended. 3. Bird droppings. Real feces would likely rank pretty close to the top of the list if you were to try to come up with the most ridiculous commodity to go to war over. That did not prevent Spain, motivated by real piles of feces, from inciting war against many South American countries. In April of 1864, Spanish settlers arrived on the Chincha Islands. These islands, which are claimed by Peru, were remarkable primarily for the fact that birds enjoyed urinating on them, although the guano reserves on the islands were valuable for use as fertilizer. The Spanish mostly wanted it to demonstrate that they did not see Peru as a legitimate nation, and that they could remove anything from the islands whenever they pleased. That's how you start a war, Peru disagreed, as did Chile, Ecuador, and Bolivia. Following a few naval engagements that both sides declared winners, the Spanish Navy returned home with the proud declaration that it had dealt a blow to those avaricious hoarders of excrement. 4. The War of the Stray Dog. An international crisis was unintentionally started by a dog in one of the most strange confrontations of the 20th century. Greece and Bulgaria, who had been at odds since the Second Balkan War in the 1910s, had been at odds for a long time before the occurrence. When a Greek soldier was shot in October 1925, apparently while pursuing his escaped dog across the border into Bulgaria, tensions eventually reached a breaking point. The shooting catalyzed the Greek invasion of Bulgaria, which resulted in the occupation of other settlements. When the League of Nations eventually stepped in and denounced the attack, they were even about to start shelling Petric. A ceasefire between the two countries was eventually brokered by an international commission, but not before the misunderstanding claimed the lives of about 50 people. 5. The War of Jenkins' Ear. A British mariner named Robert Jenkins showed members of Parliament a severed, decomposing ear in 1738. He stated in a formal testimony that he had been punished for smuggling 7 years prior by having his ear cut off by a Spanish Coast Guard officer. Inspired by this powerful testimony, the British quickly launched war against Spain, and so the ridiculous War of Jenkins' Ear started. The truth is that a conflict between the British and the Spanish had been planned since the early 18th century. Jenkins's lost ear was just the perfect excuse to start it. The Spanish had been besieging and harassing English vessels, including the one that Jenkins was captaining, and there were territorial issues about the line between Spanish Florida and British Georgia that led to the fight. In Florida and Georgia, fighting broke out in late 1739 and lasted for 2 years, with no side being able to claim victory. Later, the fight combined with the larger War of the Austrian Succession, which lasted until 1748. 6. A really nice chair. If there was one thing that European nations enjoyed doing in the past, it was chopping up Africa and sitting on them while acting like kings. This was being done by the British to the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana. In 1900, Britain sent a chinless Yahoo named Sir Frederick Mitchell Hodgson to set the Ashanti Empire, who were already residing there, on the right track. Sadly for the British, Hodgson was a complete moron. He declared that the Queen of England was now in command when he arrived in the town of Kumasi, a very fine golden stool, and demanded vehemently to know why he, as the Queen's envoy, wasn't seated on it. The Ashanti believed that the stool held the spirit of their country, their ancestors, and the future generations. It was considered a sacred thing. The Ashanti were so offended by the suggestion that Hodgson's colonial buttocks should caress the embodiment of their people that the War of the Golden Stool broke out immediately. Happily, the conflict ended, and the Ashanti managed to preserve their appearance of independence. 7. The Toledo War. Although Ohio and Michigan have a long-standing football rivalry, the two states almost went to war over a boundary dispute once. The dispute started in 1803 when Toledo's town was moved to a small plot of property owned by the newly established state of Ohio. Later, in the 1830s, Michigan territory challenged Ohio's claim to this Toledo Strip, sparking a contentious discussion that aired on the verge of violence for several weeks. Both sides fought for governmental dominance of the region in what is now known as the Toledo War, and both organized militias to stave off a potential enemy invasion. President Andrew Jackson ultimately stepped in 1835, desperate to secure Ohio's crucial electoral votes, and by 1836, a deal was concluded. Under the détente, statehood and a piece of the Upper Peninsula were exchanged for Michigan Territory's renunciation of its claim to the Toledo Strip. While many saw the ruling as a huge injustice, several people who had lived in the contested area quickly accepted that they were now officially Ohioans. One woman is reported to have joked, "Thank the Lord, I never did like that Michigan weather anyway," upon hearing of the decision. 8. The pastry war. Large swaths of Mexico City were destroyed by enraged rioters during a military takeover in 1828. Remontel, a French pastry maker living abroad, lost a lot of money to looters after his tiny cafe was broken into during the disturbances. Remontel filed a request for compensation with the French government when Mexican officials disregarded his grievances. It wasn't until 10 years later that King Louis Philippe became aware of his plea. Already incensed at Mexico's non-payment of millions of peso debts, the king now asked that they pay 600,000 pesos to make up for the pastry chef's losses. As the Mexicans refused to give up such a huge amount of money, Louis Philippe did the unthinkable and declared war. A French fleet arrived in Mexico in October 1838 and blockaded Veracruz. The ships started bombarding the fortress of San Juan de Ulua as the Mexicans continued to refuse to pay. After a few little skirmishes, up to 250 men had perished by December. Even the well-known commander Santa Anna, who was wounded by grape shot and had to lose a leg, came out of retirement to command the Mexican army against the French. When a peace agreement was mediated by the British administration in March 1839, hostilities eventually came to a stop. The 600,000 pesos was a hefty fee for a pastry store at the time, but the Mexicans were required to pay it as part of the deal. 9. Drunk jerk. Not everyone on the island of Sicily was delighted about France's occupation of their island in 1282, up until the Palermite community assembled for Vespers. The Easter prayer service, the French and the Sicilians were only getting along with each other in a resentful manner. Something happened in the town square at some time. The specifics are hazy at this point. According to one account, a French soldier attempted to drag a French woman from the crowd after becoming intoxicated. Others claimed that when the French soldiers decided to search the crowd for weapons, they took advantage of the situation to make out with every woman in attendance. Whatever the case, the Sicilians were not amused, and the altercation that started during Vespers escalated into a massacre of French citizens in Palermo. Then it escalated into a full-fledged war, drawing several neighboring kingdoms into the struggle and proving the limitless destructive potential that every inebriated douchebag possesses. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe.